The President of the United States of America is one of the most influential people in the world. Every 4 years, a fierce battle for this position unfolds in the country. But even between elections, the struggle never stops. Sometimes such tension leads to real bloodshed. Throughout American history, presidents have often become targets of assassination attempts, sometimes successful, sometimes not. 4 presidents were killed while in office, and another was wounded during his term. Both former presidents and presidential candidates have also been injured. Dozens more assassination attempts were thwarted in advance and did not result in casualties. And just recently, there was yet another incident that shook the entire country. Another attempted assassination of the head of state. The administration is looking for those responsible. The former FBI director has been charged with threatening to kill the president. A fierce debate about political assassinations has erupted in society. Democrats blame Republicans for escalating the situation, while Republicans blame Democrats. In this video, we will look at the history of assassination attempts on US presidents. Who are these people who take up arms? Why are American leaders killed? How often have such assassination attempts occurred? What do they lead to? Let's figure it out. The first serious assassination attempt on an American president took place in 1835. At that time, the head of state was Andrew Jackson. The figure of Andrew Jackson has always been considered one of the most controversial in American history. Among other things, this president was known for sometimes ignoring Supreme Court decisions. Jackson is credited with the phrase about the head of this body, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And once, he even threatened his vice president that he would hang him. Thanks to his combative and uncompromising nature, Andrew Jackson made quite a few enemies. The president often received letters threatening violence against him. Once, while he was traveling on a steamboat, he was attacked by an angry young man, though the man was unarmed and only used his fists. But a much more serious attack was the assassination attempt carried out by a painter named Richard Lawrence. This man had struggled with mental health issues throughout his life. His father had previously been committed to a mental institution. As Richard grew older, his own condition also became increasingly dire. He quit his job and told those close to him about his hallucinations and visions. Lawrence began to see himself as the English King Richard III. When asked how he planned to support himself, he replied that the US government would soon pay him a huge sum of money because it was in his debt. Over time, the man began to blame President Andrew Jackson for not returning his money. Before the attack, Lawrence became completely unstable. He would lash out at people, talk to himself, and laugh for no reason. A witness reported that on the day before the attack, Lawrence was sitting and reading a book. Then he suddenly stood up and chuckling said, "I'll be damned if I don't do it." After that, Lawrence took 2 pistols and headed toward the president. He had been stalking Andrew Jackson for several weeks already. The assassin set up an ambush right near the Capitol building. When Andrew Jackson walked by, the shooter opened fire. Or rather, he tried to open fire, but the first shot misfired. Instead of running away or hiding, Jackson, on the contrary, headed straight toward the stunned shooter. Lawrence grabbed his second pistol and pulled the trigger again. There was a second misfire. The enraged president beat the attacker with his cane. In the end, the crowd separated the 2 men fighting. By a fortunate turn of events, no one was killed. Lawrence was later tried and found to be insane. While almost no one remembers the first known assassination attempt on a US president these days, nearly everyone knows about the first successful one. We're talking about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The murder took place on April 14, 1865, during the final stage of the bloody Civil War. Just a few days before that, Confederate General Robert Lee had surrendered to the Union Army. In fact, the war was already over, although isolated battles on land and at sea continued for several more months. Despite this, the actor John Booth, a supporter of the South, continued to believe in the Confederacy's victory. Initially, his plan was to kidnap President Lincoln and hold him hostage. The idea was that this would benefit the Confederate States, but he abandoned it in favor of a more deadly plan. Booth began plotting an assassination. Several months before the murder, he attended President Lincoln's inauguration when Lincoln was re-elected for a second term. Later, the future assassin told his colleague,
"What an excellent chance I had to kill the president if I had wished on Inauguration Day."
John Booth recruited 2 of his old friends so that together they could assassinate the political and military leadership of the United States. The conspirators divided the targets among themselves. Booth's 2 friends were supposed to kill the vice president and the secretary of state, while John Booth himself took responsibility for President Lincoln and the Union Army General Ulysses Grant. On the eve of the assassination, Booth wrote in his diary,
"But our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done."
The plan was for the actor John Booth to kill the president and the general during a theatrical comedy performance. It was the comedy play Our American Cousin. It was being performed at the theater where Booth worked. He decided that he would use his position to enter the box where the victims would be seated without arousing suspicion. But at the last moment, it turned out that General Grant had decided not to attend the performance. This circumstance saved his life. 4 years later, Ulysses Grant would win the election and become the 18th President of the United States. The actor Assassin, of course, knew the play being performed very well. He knew when the hall would fall silent and at which moments the audience would burst into laughter. Booth decided that he would enter the box when the room was noisy. At one point in the play, a character argues with an elderly woman. In the argument, he uses elaborate insults, which can be loosely translated as, "You damned old sockdologizing man-trap." It was this phrase that Booth used as his signal. As we now know, this was the last thing President Lincoln heard before his death. John Booth slipped inside and found the president sitting in a rocking chair. At that moment, he was laughing at the actor's line. At close range, the bullet struck Lincoln in the head. After that, Booth stabbed the army major sitting nearby. Immediately after the attack, he jumped out of the theater box straight into the auditorium. At that moment, Booth caught his boot spur on the curtain, landed awkwardly on one leg, and nearly fell because of it. After that, he ran onto the stage and shouted the Latin phrase, "Sic semper tyrannis," which literally means, "thus always to tyrants." Chaos broke out in the auditorium. The audience thought that Booth running onto the stage was part of the performance. The assassin managed to escape, at least for a few weeks. In the end, he was killed by soldiers during an attempt to apprehend him. Doctors tried to save the president, but the next morning, he died without regaining consciousness. The other assassination attempts by the group of conspirators were not as successful. Booth's accomplice, Lewis Powell, broke into the U.S. Secretary of State's house while he was lying sick in bed. Powell pretended to be the secretary's doctor's assistant and acted as if he had brought him medicine. The sick politician's children sensed something was wrong just in time. A scuffle broke out. The conspirator slashed the bedridden Secretary of State's face with a knife, but missed any major arteries, and he survived. As for the attempt on the vice president, it turned out to be completely ridiculous. Another of John Booth's accomplices rented a room in the hotel where the politician was staying. He brought a pistol and a knife with him, but before the attack, he decided to stop by the bar for a bit. As a result, he got so drunk he blacked out, started wandering the streets, and lost his knife. In the end, none of the conspirators escaped to justice. Booth himself, as I already mentioned, was shot. 2 of his accomplices were tried by a military tribunal. They were found guilty and executed by hanging. Abraham Lincoln became the first assassinated president of the United States. After his death, the office passed to Vice President Andrew Johnson. Interestingly, Johnson, unlike Lincoln, was a Democrat, not a Republican. The fact is that in the last election, the Republicans formed a coalition with the Democrats, more precisely with those Democrats who opposed the secession of the southern states. And yes, at that time, most Democrats supported the secession of the South, that is, the Confederacy, all those southern states with their slavery and strong traditions. As a result, as a compromise, the Republican Lincoln's vice president became Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a Democrat from the southern slaveholding state of Tennessee. He was the only Democratic senator who did not switch to the Confederacy after the war began. This choice was meant to symbolize reconciliation between the two sides, and in a sense, this step worked. An overwhelming majority of voters cast their ballots for Lincoln and Johnson. But by a twist of fate, this decision led to a paradoxical situation. The Republican candidate won the election by a huge margin. The North defeated the seceded Southerners in a grueling civil war. But as a result of this war, the President of the United States became a Democrat from a southern slaveholding state. For Northerners, the news of the president's assassination was a true tragedy. Southerners, on the contrary, saw Lincoln as their enemy. At the same time, it was not customary to publicly speak ill of the murdered president. But behind closed doors, Southerners did not hold back in their remarks. An analysis of the personal diaries of former Confederates reveals deep hostility and gloating over Lincoln's death. Interestingly, Southerners hated the new president, who was also supposedly a Southerner, almost even more than Lincoln, because they saw him not just as an enemy, but as a traitor. The first and only president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis, recalled,
For an enemy so relentless in the war for our subjugation, we could not be expected to mourn yet. In view of its political consequences, it could not be regarded otherwise than as a great misfortune to the South. He had power over the Northern people and was without personal malignity toward the people of the South. His successor, Johnson of Tennessee, was without power in the North and the embodiment of malignity toward the Southern people, perhaps the more so because he had betrayed and deserted them in the hour of their need.
Outside of America, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln shocked the entire world. Condolences came from a wide range of countries, from China to Chile and Liberia. The foreign minister of the Russian Empire wrote that the blow dealt to Mr. Lincoln was deeply felt in Russia. It should be noted that at that time, Russia and the United States of America had a very friendly relationship. It hadn't even been 20 years before the United States was once again shaken by the assassination of a president. This time, the victim was the Republican James Garfield. But this crime was very different from the events of 1865. Lincoln was killed as part of a planned conspiracy. The conspirators had a clear political goal. Other high-ranking members of the administration were also targeted. Garfield, on the other hand, was shot by a lone gunman, Charles Guiteau. This assassination attempt had no obvious political motive. Initially, Guiteau was actually a supporter of President Garfield. He supported him in the last election and not just with his vote. Guiteau wrote a speech in support of the Republican and even printed it on several hundred flyers. He persistently handed out his works to every politician he could reach. Guiteau would loiter for hours around Republican events. He tried to make useful connections, but most attendees described him as unkempt and eccentric, even though he boasted that he had seen many important people in person more than once. For example, according to him, he met Vice President Chester more than 20 times. Guiteau tried to get himself invited as a speaker at some important Republican event, and one day he even succeeded. Party officials allowed him to give the opening remarks at a rally in front of supporters. However, once he stepped up to the podium, Guiteau quickly lost his nerve and was unable to deliver more than a few sentences of his speech. Moreover, the speech that Guiteau was promoting was frankly bizarre. The thing is, our would-be speaker had written it in support of another Republican candidate, the legendary Union General Ulysses Grant, who was running for a third term. But unexpectedly for everyone, Grant lost his party's nomination. The speech had to be hastily rewritten. As a result, the text was full of inconsistencies and confusion. The achievements of one politician were attributed to another. It ended up making no sense at all. Nevertheless, after the Republican Garfield's victory, Charles Guiteau believed that it was his efforts that helped Garfield win. He kept hanging around Republican events, visited the White House reception room, and wrote letters to President Garfield. In these letters, Guiteau gave him advice on how to win the next election and what policies to pursue. Charles Guiteau believed that the president owed him a favor. One day, he managed to get an audience with the president at the White House and handed him a copy of that very same rambling speech of his. It was a kind of reminder like, remember how I helped you out, wrote a speech in your support, now help me out too. He bombarded the White House with letters, asking to be appointed as an ambassador. At first, Guiteau insisted that he be sent to Vienna. One day, he even wrote a letter to the Secretary of State where he lied, claiming that President Garfield approved such a decision.
What I wish to say is this. I think the president feels well disposed toward me about the Austrian mission.
But for some reason, Guiteau did not receive the appointment to Austria. Then he said, well, if that's the case, I'll agree to an appointment in Paris. One day, Guiteau once again showed up at the State Department and started talking about his appointment to Europe. At that point, the Secretary of State lost his patience and said,
never speak to me again on the Paris consulship as long as you live.
Charles was also asked not to bother the State Department secretaries. In the end, he was completely banned from appearing at the White House. Charles Guiteau began to harbor anger and resentment toward the president, whom he started calling a tyrant. Guiteau considered himself betrayed, and over time he came to believe that God wanted Garfield dead and had chosen Guiteau himself as his instrument. It should be noted here that Guiteau's relatives had long considered him mentally ill. 6 years before the assassination attempt, Guiteau attacked his sister with an axe. They wanted to have him committed to a psychiatric hospital, but at that time he simply ran away. Eventually, Guiteau went to a store and decided to buy a pistol there. He chose an expensive revolver with a white ivory handle. But Charles didn't have enough money for such a purchase, even though he went into debt to buy the weapon. He could only afford to buy a revolver of the same brand, but with a regular wooden handle. Guiteau decided that such a pistol looked too cheap. It wouldn't look very nice in the museum that would surely be built in his honor after he killed the tyrant Garfield. Our hero started bargaining, and the shopkeeper gave him a discount. In the end, Guiteau bought the coveted pistol. On the day of the attack, James Garfield was leaving for a 2-week vacation. In the morning, he arrived at the train station to go meet his wife. The president was without security. Only the Secretary of State and his sons were with him. At that early hour, there were hardly any people at the station. Charles Guiteau approached from behind and, without warning, opened fire. 2 shots rang out. One only slightly scratched the president's arm, the other hit him in the back. Garfield turned around and shouted something like, "My God, what is that?" After the shooting, Garfield remained conscious. A doctor quickly rushed over at the sound of gunfire. Soon, other doctors arrived as well. The president's condition was stabilized. He was taken back to the White House. For several weeks, Garfield fought for his life, and at times it even seemed that he was recovering. But in the end, death prevailed. James Garfield died 2.5 months after the attack. It is now generally believed that the president's life could have been saved. The doctors made several critical mistakes. For example, they did not disinfect their hands or instruments when examining the wounds immediately after the shooting. This was considered improper even by the standards of the late 19th century. Thus, James Garfield became the second US president to be killed while in office. He served in office for only 6 months. The assassin was apprehended almost immediately. Charles Guiteau did not deny it and simply admitted, "I did it, I will go to jail for it." People in the gathered crowd shouted that Guiteau should be lynched on the spot, but the police took the man to the station. From prison, Guiteau wrote a letter to the new president, who was, of course, the former vice president.
My inspiration is a godsend to you, and I presume that you appreciate it. It raises you from a political cipher to the President of the United States. Never think of Garfield's removal as murder. It was an act of Garfield resulting from a political necessity for which he was responsible.
Guiteau also began sending political advice to the new president by mail. Charles was charged with murder. The trial attracted enormous public attention. The defendant enjoyed the media attention and the commotion. And this was despite the fact that during the trial there were actually 2 assassination attempts on him. In court, Guiteau's defense was based on the claim that he was insane. However, later the defendant changed his mind and started saying that it was all made up. Because of his antics, the trial turned into a real farce. The defendant laughed, told stories, argued with the judge, his own lawyers, and witnesses. He gave advice to those present. For example, once he suggested that the jurors should take more walks to improve their digestion. He called the witnesses dirty liars and the prosecutor an old hog. Guiteau tried to shift responsibility onto the doctors, claiming that Garfield died not from the gunshot, but because the doctors treated him incorrectly. And once in court, he gave a speech saying that God had ordered him to kill the president and that God's orders are above any laws of mortals. In the end, the jury found Charles Guiteau guilty. The defendant was surprised by this. He even started preparing for the fact that after being released, he would travel around the country giving lectures and was even planning to run for president in the next election. But in the end, things didn't work out for Charles Guiteau. Luck was not on his side. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out just a few days before the first anniversary of the attack on the president. Fragments of Charles Guiteau's brain are now kept in one of the American museums. The assassination of President James Garfield sparked discussions about possible reforms in the country. There had already been talk in America for some time that the current system of distributing government positions was outdated. Every time a new president took office, he would remove all previous members of the administration from their positions. These positions were handed out to the numerous allies and sponsors of the head of state. Previously, this state of affairs was not a major problem. The federal government was small, but over time the state apparatus grew larger. Even Garfield himself, who was assassinated, advocated for the need to reform such an appointment system. The case of Charles Guiteau became a vivid example for supporters of change, since this man resorted to assassinating the president because he was denied the government position he desired. Cartoons appeared in the press depicting Charles Guiteau as a bandit with a pistol. In the cartoon, Guiteau shouts, "In office or your life?" As a result, Congress passed a law that limited the president's authority regarding certain appointments. From then on, only people who passed a special commission's exam could become officials in these positions. The new law also prohibited the dismissal of certain civil servants for political reasons. Until then, American presidents did not have any service that protected the head of state. Such bodyguards did not appear even after the assassination of James Garfield. It took another presidential assassination for Americans to seriously consider creating a specialized agency. The next US president was killed just 20 years later, in 1901. The victim was Republican William McKinley. Unlike the conspiracy against Lincoln or even the strange lone act of Guiteau, this attempt was carried out by a committed lone anarchist. His name was Leon Czolgosz. He was a 28-year-old man, a descendant of immigrants from Poland. Leon's anarchist views developed gradually. He read various leftist newspapers and pamphlets and attended socialist circles. At different times, Leon worked at one factory and then another. His colleagues described him as a diligent worker, but at the same time, they said he was not a very sociable person. In 1893, an economic crisis occurred in the United States. The workers began to strike. At that time, Czolgosz began devoting more time to reading radical literature and immersed himself in politics. He became convinced that the rich always exploit the poor, and that the American government and all its officials are the enemies of the working class. Czolgosz called the president the main enemy of the people. Czolgosz was inspired by the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy by an anarchist in 1900. It was then that he decided it would be right to kill the American president as well. The young man tried to join the ranks of the anarchists. He greatly respected the anarchist thinker Emma Goldman, but they did not accept him into their ranks. He was considered too crazy and radical, and because of this, they suspected him of being a police plant. So Leon decided he would prove the seriousness of his intentions through action. He found out that President McKinley was planning to visit a large fair in the state of New York. It was dedicated to technological progress and the dawn of the 20th century. It was a huge event that took place over a large area and included exhibitions on a wide variety of topics in many pavilions. In total, about 8 million people visited the fair. The event's program included a segment where the president was supposed to meet visitors, interact with them, and shake hands. Concerns arose among McKinley's entourage. There were a lot of people at the exhibition. The president's visit was widely publicized. Anything could happen. They tried to dissuade the president from attending the event for security reasons, but he just brushed it off.
I have no enemies. Why should I fear?
The White House secretary canceled the visit twice, but each time McKinley ordered the trip to be put back on his schedule. Concerns were heightened by the fact that McKinley really disliked appearing in public with security present. He simply enjoyed talking to people. He was afraid that the presence of police officers and soldiers nearby would look bad. Despite the concerns, McKinley went to the fair. Leon Czolgosz also went to the event. He brought a pistol with him. Nothing noteworthy happened on the first day of the fair. Czolgosz was unable to get close to the president, although he did see him with his own eyes. But on the second day, the very event took place where McKinley was shaking hands and talking with visitors to the exhibition. At first, the president gave a speech in front of a large crowd and then began interacting with the public. A long line formed. Czolgosz quickly joined the line along with everyone else. He had wrapped his right hand in advance with a large white handkerchief under which he hid a loaded revolver. At 4:07, Czolgosz approached the president. McKinley saw the wrapped hand, thought that the man must be injured, and out of politeness extended his left hand instead of his right. At that moment, Czolgosz grabbed the president's hand with his left hand and pulled him closer, then with his right hand, he pulled the trigger twice. Before Czolgosz could fire a third shot, he was seized and thrown to the ground by bystanders from the crowd. Once again, cries rang out that the murderer ought to be lynched. Naturally, Leon was beaten, but the police took control of the situation and managed to detain the assassin. McKinley remained conscious. The bullet struck him right in the abdomen. He was bleeding heavily, but at first it seemed that the wound was not fatal. Immediately after the shots, the wounded president said that the shooter should be treated gently. McKinley was quickly taken to the medical station that had been set up at the fair. When the president was placed on the operating table, a bullet fell out from the folds of his clothing. As it was later discovered, one of the two shots hit the president's button directly. The bullet ricocheted off to the side, only slightly scratching McKinley and getting stuck in the fabric of his clothes. But the second bullet, which wounded the president, could not be found. Interestingly, there was an X-ray machine present at the exhibition, but at that time it was a novelty. None of those present knew how to use it. The inventor of the device, Thomas Edison, was not nearby. This circumstance may have proved fatal for the wounded McKinley. An X-ray would have made it possible to locate and remove the bullet from the president's body, which was very important for his treatment. At first, McKinley felt well, so well in fact that Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was even told that the president would soon recover. So Roosevelt went off to the mountains to rest. In one letter he wrote,
Everything is going on most satisfactorily with the president. I feel assured is not only that he will recover, but that his recovery will be so speedy that in a very short time he will be able to resume his duties.
But after a few days, the president's condition suddenly worsened. It became clear that the bullet had caused an infection. 8 days after the attack, William McKinley passed away. Leon Czolgosz didn't even try to defend himself in court. He openly admitted to what he had done. He set out his confession in a statement he wrote shortly after his arrest.
I planned to shoot the president 3 or 4 days ago. When I shot him, I intended to kill him, and the reason for my intention was that I did not believe in presidents having more power or status than ordinary people. I was willing to sacrifice both myself and the president for the good of the country.
The shooter refused a lawyer because, as an anarchist, he believed the state had no right to judge him. Czolgosz ignored the appointed lawyer and did not answer any of his questions. The jury quickly found Leon Czolgosz guilty. He was executed in the electric chair. Before his death, he said that he killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people. The assassination of William McKinley led to a number of important consequences for America. He was a fairly popular politician. His death was mourned throughout the country. It was because of this incident that the American Congress for the first time ordered the creation of a security detail for the president. These responsibilities were assigned to the Secret Service. Before that, it had been created solely to combat counterfeiters. The fact is, by the end of the Civil War, there was a real epidemic of counterfeit money in the States. According to estimates, between a third and a half of all circulating banknotes were counterfeit. So yes, a separate secret service was needed to combat this phenomenon. Interestingly, the law establishing it was signed by Abraham Lincoln, and it happened on the very day he was assassinated. Although the service actually began operating a little later, a few months after that. And after the assassination of McKinley, as you understand, the US Secret Service acquired new functions, protecting the president around the clock. The assassination of McKinley had another consequence. It led to the first tightening of immigration laws in a long time. The fact is, for most Americans of that era, the shooter's Polish background seemed highly suspicious and his name, Leon Czolgosz, sounded exotic. The incident provoked a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment. The president's death also triggered a wave of panic about the existence of anarchist cells. Rumors spread that Czolgosz had not acted alone, but with other anarchists. A number of anarchists were arrested by the police on suspicion of conspiracy. However, a few weeks later, they were all released and no charges were filed. It was precisely the widespread fear of anarchists and other radicals that ultimately played a role in the creation of the FBI in 1908. After the death of William McKinley, his vice president Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. But, strangely enough, McKinley's role in this story does not end there. The fact is, after his death, McKinley's ghost wanted to take revenge on his successor. The spirit of the deceased president inspired another person to take up arms and kill Roosevelt. At least, that's what the man who later made an unsuccessful attempt on Theodore Roosevelt's life claimed. In 1912, the politician was preparing to run for another presidential term. 4 years earlier, he had failed to do so. This time, he lost the Republican Party nomination, but instead of giving up, Roosevelt created his own party and put himself forward as a candidate. Interestingly, Theodore Roosevelt was actually one of the few American presidents who even tried to run for a third presidential term. At that time, it was not formally prohibited. And so, in fact, things continued until the rise to power of Theodore's fifth cousin, and incidentally, the husband of Theodore's niece, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who not only served 3, but a full 4 consecutive presidential terms. But it was considered, let's say, against the unwritten rules. We had agreed not to usurp power, so after 2 terms, we would step down. But Theodore Roosevelt decided that such rules did not suit him. The election campaign was in full swing. The presidential candidate was making about a dozen speeches a day. On October 14th, Roosevelt was speaking to his supporters in the state of Wisconsin. He was delivering his speech while standing in the back of a car. There were 9,000 people in the crowd. Suddenly, a figure with a pistol appeared among the people. The man came closer, raised his hand, and fired a single shot at Roosevelt. The bullet struck the former president in the chest, but by a fortunate coincidence, Roosevelt had a metal glasses case in his breast pocket, which slowed the bullet down. In that same pocket, he also had a 50-page paper copy of his speech. The shooter was immediately tackled to the ground and disarmed. Roosevelt's aide took the pistol from him and handed it to his boss. The shooter was dragged over to Roosevelt and he asked, "Why did you do it? What was your reason?" But Theodore Roosevelt did not receive a clear answer. He ordered that no violence be used against the shooter. The man was soon handed over to the arriving police officers. At first, Roosevelt was so startled that he didn't immediately realize he had been wounded, and when he did, he also understood that the bullet hadn't hit any vital organs or pierced his lungs. The presidential candidate saw an excellent opportunity for a dramatic political move. He decided to deliver his speech while wounded. They tried to dissuade him, but Roosevelt only said dramatically,
"You get me to that speech. It may be the last I shall deliver, but I'm going to deliver this one."
Upon arriving at the venue, Roosevelt began his speech with these words.
"Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. But fortunately, I had my manuscript, so you see I was going to make a long speech, and there is a bullet. There is where the bullet went through, and it probably saved me from it going into my heart. The bullet is in me now, so that I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best."
Roosevelt called himself a bull moose because the moose was the symbol of his newly formed party. In general, in the United States, almost every party has its own animal symbol. For the Republicans, it's the elephant. For the Democrats, the donkey. For the Libertarian Party, it's a porcupine or a snake, something you can't step on. And Roosevelt chose the moose. A little later, when the shooter was in custody, a guard would have a conversation with him and ask if he liked hunting. To this, the prisoner replied that no, only if it was moose hunting. Roosevelt's speech lasted a whole hour, and even a bit longer. At one point, someone started shouting that it was all staged and fake. Roosevelt wasn't actually wounded. In response, he unbuttoned his vest and showed the audience a bloodstain on his white shirt near his chest. Several times, the former president's aides tried to persuade him to leave the podium, but he remained steadfast. After the speech ended, the presidential candidate was taken to the hospital. There he was given an X-ray, which confirmed that the bullet was inside and had not hit any vital organs. The shooter turned out to be a man named John Schrank. The police discovered that the shooter had diary notes with him. In them, it was described how the ghost of President McKinley would visit Schrank. He told John that Roosevelt was to blame for his death, and in the end, the late McKinley addressed the future shooter.
"Let not a murderer take the presidential chair. Avenge my death."
At the trial, John Schrank said that he did not want to kill Roosevelt, but he also clarified that he shot him as a warning to all tyrants who wanted to run for a third term.
"Any man looking for a third term ought to be shot."
In the end, the shooter was found to be mentally ill. Instead of the death penalty, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital. He spent the rest of his life there. The aforementioned Franklin Roosevelt went further than his relative. He not only decided to run for a third term, he was elected, not just for a third, but also for a fourth term. At the same time, in another sense, Franklin almost repeated Theodore's path, namely, he was attacked by a mentally unstable person. This happened at the beginning of 1933, 21 years after the attempt on Theodore's life. Franklin had won the election, but had not yet taken office as president. He was giving a short speech in Florida. Also present was an eccentric short man named Giuseppe Zangara, an immigrant from Italy. He was an anarchist and basically hated all politicians. A few days earlier, Zangara had bought a cheap revolver at a pawn shop. At first, he planned to kill the sitting president, Herbert Hoover, but changed his mind and decided to attack Roosevelt, who had recently won the election. He happened to be in the same city as Giuseppe. Because of his short stature, Zangara couldn't properly aim over the heads of people in the crowd. He climbed onto an unstable folding bench, and when Roosevelt finished his speech, he opened fire. The shooter shouted, "Too many people are starving to death." 5 shots rang out in quick succession, but a woman standing nearby saw the gun and struck the shooter's hand. His aim was thrown off. Thanks to her decisive actions, not a single bullet hit Roosevelt, but 5 other people were wounded. The most seriously injured was the mayor of Chicago, Anton Chemak. It would later turn out that the wound was fatal for him. The shooter was quickly apprehended at the scene. Giuseppe Zangara clearly exhibited some signs of mental illness. He had no friends at all and was unemployed. Giuseppe suffered from chronic stomach pain. He blamed the powerful of this world for it, and at some point began to think that the president himself was personally responsible for his pain. However, the court found him to be mentally competent. Zangara was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out soon after. The last successful assassination of an American president took place in 1963, the last one as of the time this video is being recorded, though of course that could change. You are of course familiar with this assassination attempt. In the city of Dallas, John Kennedy was killed by a shot to the head. John Kennedy was visiting the state of Texas. This was a period in American history when the southern states, previously loyal to the Democrats, began gradually leaning toward the Republicans. Democrat Kennedy was worried that his progressive initiatives might completely alienate the conservative population in the South. The next presidential election was already looming on the horizon, so the visit to Dallas was supposed to serve as a kind of prelude to the election campaign. Kennedy's entourage had some concerns about this trip. A little earlier, it became known that thousands of flyers were being distributed in the city featuring Kennedy's face and the caption, "Wanted for treason." There were about 20,000 windows along the planned route of the motorcade. Naturally, the Secret Service could not monitor all 20,000. In addition, according to statistics, every 5th resident of Dallas carried a firearm. Despite this, it was decided that the risk of an assassination attempt was not too high. There were also several other factors that worked against Kennedy. For example, it was decided not to install the removable roof on the car. After all, it was a hot day, and Kennedy wanted to greet the people of Dallas personally, face to face. The car had bulletproof side windows, but on that day they were lowered. In Dallas, the president drove through the city streets along a pre-announced route. He was sitting in the passenger seat of the convertible next to his wife. As the car was slowly driving down Elm Street, several shots rang out. They were fired from the 6th floor of the school book depository. One of the bullets struck Kennedy in the head and proved fatal for the president. Lee Harvey Oswald immediately became the prime suspect. This man was arrested soon after the assassination attempt. However, 2 days later, he was shot dead, live on air by another man. Kennedy's assassination became a unique incident because, unlike other attempts, the shooter did not admit his guilt. Lee Harvey Oswald continued to insist until his death that he had been framed. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, quickly organized a special commission to investigate the assassination attempt. The commission worked for almost a whole year and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He fired 3 times from an Italian rifle with a telescopic sight, which he had purchased by mail under a false name. Oswald's motives remain unclear. The commission noted his Marxist beliefs, dissatisfaction with life, desire to go down in history, and possible wish to punish the American system. But no one found a definitive explanation. The results of the investigation were compiled into a report nearly 900 pages long. The final version was handed over to the new president by the commission members after 10 months of work. Even back then, the findings of the investigation were criticized by various journalists and observers. Especially since, in the 1970s, another congressional commission investigated Kennedy's assassination. It did not dispute Lee Harvey Oswald's guilt, but concluded that he likely did not act alone. Most Americans today do not believe the official version. A multitude of different conspiracy theories have arisen around the president's assassination. Some believe that Kennedy was killed by the FBI, others point to the KGB or Fidel Castro. Still others say that the American military-industrial complex was behind the assassination. There are a great many different versions. In the press, the discussions surrounding John Kennedy's assassination are sometimes called the mother of all conspiracy theories. And indeed, it was this very incident that largely popularized conspiracy theories in America. However, during this period, the 60s and 70s, there was already a decline in trust toward the government in the United States. The atmosphere of distrust was reinforced by the unpopular Vietnam War, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Watergate scandal, and many other factors. And the murder of the popular head of state, the public's favorite John Kennedy, became just one more destabilizing circumstance. In addition, the sudden death of the president led to significant changes in the US Secret Service. The agency was substantially reformed. The commission that investigated Kennedy's assassination concluded that the Secret Service protocols were outdated. The agency's budgets increased sharply, special counter-sniper units were created, and strategies for perimeter control were changed. The presidential limousine now always has a roof, and the car itself is heavily armored. In general, since the second half of the 20th century, assassination attempts on American presidents have become more frequent. However, it should be noted that they have less often resulted in fatalities. But the number of attempts to carry out such actions is increasing. This circumstance can probably be partly explained by the fact that there are simply more people living in the country now, and accordingly, there is a greater risk of finding someone capable of such an act. Moreover, it should be understood that not only has the overall population increased, but there are also far more people directly involved in politics. Perhaps the issue is that nowadays, foiled assassination attempts are easier to document and preserve for history. Surveillance methods are much more advanced today, and now the president is protected by a secret service that monitors all possible threats to the head of state. Virtually every American president in the past 70 years has, at some point, become the target of a planned assassination attempt. For example, one US citizen intended to kill Richard Nixon. The man positioned himself with a firearm near the highway where the presidential motorcade was passing, but he couldn't take aim because the car was moving too fast. So the shooter attacked another politician, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace. He was wounded, but ultimately survived. After the shooter was apprehended, a diary with strange entries was found on him. He wrote that he was planning to kill either Nixon or Wallace. This person was also diagnosed with schizophrenia. Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, survived 2 assassination attempts in September of 1975 alone, although perhaps it would be more accurate to say 1.5 assassination attempts. The thing is, the first time, the president was attacked by a woman who forgot to load her pistol. She got close to Ford, pulled out her weapon, aimed it at the president, and pulled the trigger, but the gun didn't fire. The woman was quickly apprehended. It was later revealed that she was a follower of the infamous serial killer Charles Manson. A couple of weeks later, there was another assassination attempt on Ford. This time, the shooter was another woman. This time, the woman did not forget to load her weapon, but she missed, and the bullet did not hit the president. The only sitting US president who was wounded but survived an assassination attempt was Ronald Reagan. The attack took place in 1981, and it happened because a young man named John Hinckley fell in love with Hollywood actress Jodie Foster. The thing is, John Hinckley had a strange obsession with the film Taxi Driver. Hinckley watched it at least 15 times. He began to associate himself with the film's main character. Hinckley dressed in the same clothes as the main character, ate the same food, and drank the same alcohol. He also bought himself the same kind of weapon as the character in the film. That very actress, Jodie Foster, starred in Taxi Driver. Hinckley became literally obsessed with this girl. He began stalking the actress, found out her phone number, mailing address, and place of residence. He wrote her letters, called her on the phone, and even left paper messages, which he shoved under the door. But all of it was unsuccessful. At some point, Hinckley decided that he needed to get Jodie's attention through decisive, radical actions. And as such a method, he chose to assassinate the President of the United States. But finally, right before the assassination attempt, he wrote one more letter to his beloved. However, he never sent it.
There is a definite possibility that I will be killed in my attempt to get Reagan. That is why I am writing you this letter now. I confess to you the reason why I am making this attempt. I admit to you that the reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I just cannot wait any longer to impress you. I have to do something now to make you understand in no uncertain terms that I am doing all of this for your sake. By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind.
On March 30th, 1981, Reagan was giving a speech in Washington at a famous, prestigious hotel, the Washington Hilton. The Secret Service knew this place well. It was considered one of the safest venues for a presidential appearance. Perhaps that's why, on this day, the president did not wear a bulletproof vest under his suit. It was assumed that there would be no particular security risks at the event. For Reagan, the only place where there was still a risk of an assassination attempt was a small area where the president exited the building and got into his car. It was here that John Hinckley set up his ambush. The entire assassination attempt was fully captured by the cameras of the assembled reporters. Hinckley fired 6 shots in 3 seconds. A Secret Service agent shielded Reagan with his own body and took a bullet to the abdomen. Reagan was quickly pushed into the car. The car immediately drove away from the scene of the shooting. A bullet ricocheted off the armored car. The sixth and final bullet still hit the president and pierced Reagan's lung. In addition to Reagan himself, 3 other people were wounded. A whole crowd of people immediately piled onto the shooter and detained him. As a result of the shooting, none of the victims died, although the White House press secretary was very seriously wounded in the head, but he only passed away in 2014. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was the wound he had received 33 years earlier, and thus, technically, he became the only person to die as a result of the assassination attempt. Ronald Reagan made a successful recovery and was discharged after just 12 days. In his first speech after recovering, the president thanked the Secret Service agents. He also shared with the members of Congress a letter from an American schoolboy that had arrived at.
Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas. And he added a postscript. P.S. If you have to make a speech in your pajamas, I warned you.
As a result of the trial, the shooter John Hinckley was found to be legally insane. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital, where he spent more than 40 years. Hinckley is now free. He is even occasionally invited to television interviews. Now Hinckley is engaged in abstract painting and sells paintings of cats like these. You can find advertisements for them on his Twitter. By this point, Americans began to notice a strange series of coincidences. There are American presidents who win elections in years divisible by 20, for example, in 1840, 1860, and so on. Well, such presidents die while in office. After Franklin Roosevelt's victory in 1940, a journalist noted that over the past 100 years, this rule had worked without fail. First, a month after his inauguration, he died of illness. President William Harrison. Then Lincoln was assassinated. Then Garfield. After that, McKinley. In 1920, Warren Harding was elected. He died of a heart attack before the end of his term. If the curse works, said a journalist, then Franklin Roosevelt will also die while president. And what do you know? That's exactly what happened. In 1945, Roosevelt died of a stroke. It was around that time that the idea emerged that presidents dying in office was not just a coincidence. In fact, it was said to be the result of an ancient Native American curse. This curse was supposedly cast on American leaders by Chief Tecumseh, or his younger brother, accounts differ. The curse was placed after the defeat of the Native American tribes in a battle against then-General William Harrison. It was this man who would win the 1840 election and become the first victim of Tecumseh's curse. Americans remembered this legend again in 1960. That year, John Kennedy won the election. 3 years later, he was killed by a gunshot to the head. By 1980, the curse had already become a well-known urban legend. During that election, reporters even asked the Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter, if he was afraid to win. After all, you never know what might happen. Carter said he wasn't afraid. But he lost that election. That time, Ronald Reagan became president. For the first time in 140 years, the curse failed. The Republican made it to the end of his term. Although, some people like to point out that, in fact, the spell did work on Reagan too. After all, he was wounded in an assassination attempt, and quite seriously at that. The bullet pierced the president's lung. An interesting explanation was given. Supposedly, in the 19th century, when the curse was cast, such a wound would have been fatal. So, everything still works. It's just that the wizard doctor saved the president. But later, the curse was finally dispelled. George Bush, who was elected in 2000, safely completed his term. 20 years later, Joe Biden also left office alive. At the same time, throughout the entire history of the United States, 8 presidents have died in office, and only one of them was elected in a year not divisible by 20. That was Zachary Taylor, who died of illness in the mid-19th century. Assassination attempts on presidents continued even after Reagan. In 1994, the Secret Service detained a man who was preparing an attack on Clinton. On one occasion, this man even came to Washington with a weapon. But then he read in the newspaper that Bill Clinton was currently on a visit to Russia. The man went back home. Later, he told his neighbor about his plans, as well as his intention to commit suicide in this way. The neighbor recorded the conversation on a tape recorder. As a result, the man was detained before he could carry out his intentions. That same year, there was a shooting near the White House. A man fired about 30 shots toward the north lawn of the White House. He fired at a crowd of people in suits, hoping to hit Bill Clinton. Not a single bullet hit anyone. It later turned out that Clinton wasn't in that crowd at all. He was inside the building, watching football on TV. Some bullets hit the facade of the White House, and one even broke a window. When he was apprehended, the shooter was found to have a suicide note, but he was taken alive. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. A similar shooting occurred during the presidency of George Bush. In 2001, a man who was a former tax official came to the White House and started shooting at the building through the fence. At that time, George Bush was inside. The shooter was firing mostly at random because thick vegetation in that area blocked visibility. Fortunately, this incident also ended without casualties. An almost identical story happened during Obama's presidency. In 2011, a man came to Washington from another state and started shooting at the White House. No one was injured during this shooting either. The man received a 25-year prison sentence. There were other incidents involving Barack Obama as well. Even before he won the Democratic Party nomination, authorities discovered 2 skinheads who were plotting to kill presidential candidates. They were charged accordingly with conspiracy to assassinate a candidate. In the end, both pleaded guilty in court. Similar incidents continued to occur even after Obama became president. One man sent the president a letter containing a poisonous substance. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. It should be noted that the increase in assassination attempts in recent decades is linked to the fact that they began to be carried out by foreigners. In the 19th century, an American president rarely visited other countries. The United States was not an important player on the world stage. After World War II, this situation changed fundamentally. Now, the United States is essentially one of the world's hegemons. In such circumstances, it is much easier to make enemies abroad. For example, both Bushes, senior and junior, became targets of assassination attempts planned by foreign nationals. In 1993, Bush Sr. was planning to visit Kuwait. This visit was timed to coincide with the anniversary of the coalition's victory over Iraq during the recent Gulf War. The event lasted several days and went off without incident. However, it soon became known that Iraq had been preparing an assassination attempt on the American president. This was reported by the Kuwaiti authorities and American intelligence agencies. A car packed with a huge amount of explosives was discovered. CIA specialists confirmed that the explosive device was most likely of Iraqi origin. Soon after, several Iraqi citizens who had brought the explosives into the country were arrested. In 2005, there was an assassination attempt on another President Bush, George W. Bush. He made an official visit to Tbilisi. During this visit, one of the local residents threw a live grenade toward the politician. However, the grenade did not explode. The reason for the lack of an explosion was that the grenade had been wrapped too tightly in a cloth handkerchief for concealment. This handkerchief prevented the triggering mechanism from working. But perhaps the main record holder for the number of assassination attempts is the most recent US president, Donald Trump. It is often said that the recent incident is the 3rd attempt on the president's life. But that's not entirely accurate. This raises the question, what exactly can be considered an assassination attempt and what is merely an attempted attempt? In any case, Al Jazeera counts 4 incidents. Axios publishes a list of 7 assassination attempts. On Wikipedia, the list consists of as many as 18 entries. But it's important to understand that this expanded list includes both obvious cases of assassination attempts, such as when a sniper's bullet grazed the president's ear, and cases where someone was arrested for making threatening posts about Trump. The most famous and spectacular assassination attempt occurred on the eve of the presidential election. On July 13, 2024, at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump was speaking before his supporters. About 6 minutes after the speech began, 20-year-old Thomas Crooks opened fire from the roof of a building approximately 140 meters from the stage. The shooter managed to fire at least 8 shots. He wounded Trump in the ear, killed 1 spectator, and seriously injured 2 more people. Only after this did Secret Service snipers neutralize Crooks with return fire. Before moving on to the second assassination attempt, I'd like to draw your attention to one important detail in the context of various conspiracy theories. Here we have a lone gunman who shot at Donald Trump. He almost killed the American president. There are no particularly popular conspiracy theories, like the idea that this assassination attempt was organized by the deep state or the CIA or, I don't know, Fidel Castro from beyond the grave. Why? Because it was unsuccessful. But if the shot had landed just a few centimeters to the right, I assure you a whole slew of conspiracy theories would have sprung up, all based on the basic logical argument used by supporters of such theories. I mean, you don't really believe that a lone gunman could kill an entire US president, do you? This is a cognitive bias, the very same proportionality bias. We talked about it in the video about Kennedy's assassination. The essence of this bias is that people are used to thinking that a significant event can only be caused by something equally significant. If an entire US president was killed, then there must have been a major, serious conspiracy involving powerful agencies, intelligence services, America's enemies, and so on. A lone gunman simply couldn't pull this off. Although, speaking of conspiracy theories, it should be noted that initially, because the assassination attempt was unsuccessful, an opposite conspiracy theory emerged, that it was Trump who staged the attempt on his own life to get some striking photos with the American flag in the background and a bloodied ear. The second assassination attempt was much less dramatic. 58-year-old Ryan Wesley Ruth hid in the bushes near the place where Trump was playing golf. A Secret Service agent noticed the barrel of a rifle in the thicket and opened fire. Ruth ran away and didn't manage to fire a single shot. He was soon apprehended by the police, but recently, in the past few weeks, public attention has been drawn to another incident. Donald Trump and members of his cabinet were spending the evening at the Washington Hilton Hotel. This is the very hotel outside of which the assassination attempt on Reagan took place half a century ago. The event was proceeding as usual, but suddenly shots rang out in the distance. 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen tried to walk past the metal detector. When he was stopped for inspection, he broke free and suddenly ran forward. As he forced his way through, he fired at least one shot. But the chase didn't last long because the intruder stumbled and fell. At that moment, agents evacuated Trump and high-ranking officials. During the incident, one security officer was injured, but fortunately, no one was seriously hurt. The shooter was apprehended at the scene. He was later charged federally, including with the attempted assassination of the President of the United States. This is a crime punishable by up to life imprisonment. Before the attack, Allen sent an extensive manifesto letter to his family members. He explained his actions as follows.
On to why I did any of this. I am a citizen of the United States of America. What my representatives do reflects on me, and I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes.
This assassination attempt once again sparked fierce debates about political violence in the country. Leading Democratic figures, of course, condemned the violence. Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, all spoke out on the matter.
Listen, I think that here in America, we can have strong disagreements, and it is certainly the case that violence is never the answer, whether it's targeted at the right, the left, or the center.
The most left-leaning Democrats, such as New York Mayor Adiron Mandani, Bernie Sanders, and other politicians, also spoke out against such actions. At the same time, among ordinary opponents of Trump, a theory spread that the assassination attempt was staged. Although there is no real reason to believe this, as an argument, they point to the fact that the administration very actively began to use the assassination attempt to advocate for the construction of a ballroom in the White House. It is worth noting here that for the past 6 months, the construction of such a hall has been one of President Trump's favorite topics for discussion.
My condolences on the loss of your friend Charlie Kirk. May I ask, sir, personally, how are you holding up over the last day and a half, sir?
I think very good. And by the way, right there, you see all the trucks? They've just started construction of the new ballroom for the White House.
However, in recent weeks, the administration has encountered a number of legal issues with this project. The courts have frozen construction, but after the assassination attempt, the first thing Trump started talking about was how the incident proves the necessity of building the ballroom.
And I didn't want to say this, but this is why we have to have all of the attributes of what we're planning at the White House. It's actually a larger room, and it's much more secure. It's drone-proof, it's bulletproof glass. We need the ballroom. That's why Secret Service, that's why the military are demanding it. They've wanted the ballroom for 150 years for lots of different reasons.
Dozens of the most popular pro-Trump accounts online instantly picked up on this same message. All of them are demanding the construction of the ballroom. All of them. This conspiracy theory has no other arguments. That's it, just the motive. See, they want to build a ballroom, so that means he staged the assassination attempt on himself. At the same time, a debate has intensified in American society about how the left, with their rhetoric, is provoking violence in the country. Official Republican Party accounts are posting that the Democrats are deliberately fanning the flames of hatred in order to kill the president.
This political violence stems from a systemic demonization of him and his supporters by commentators, yes, by elected members of the Democrat Party, and even some in the media. This hateful and constant and violent rhetoric directed at President Trump day after day after day for 11 years has helped to legitimize this violence and bring us to this dark moment.
The scandal was sparked by a joke from comedian Jimmy Kimmel, which he told on the eve of the assassination attempt.
Our First Lady Melania is here. Look at Melania, so beautiful. Mrs. Trump, you have a glow like an expectant widow.
Donald Trump considered this to be a call for violence.
I appreciate that so many people are incensed by Kimmel's despicable call to violence. Jimmy Kimmel should be immediately fired by Disney and ABC News.
The comedian began to defend himself, saying that he did not intend to incite anyone to violence. Kimmel said that it was a joke about the large age difference between the spouses. Melania Trump did not appreciate the comedian's humor and called on the TV channel to fire him.
Kimmel's hateful and violent rhetoric is intended to divide our country. His monologue about my family isn't comedy. His words are corrosive and deepens the political sickness within America.
The chairman of the Federal Communications Commission began to say that, if necessary, he could revoke broadcasting licenses from channels, especially if they behave inappropriately. While the comedian's joke can certainly be called inappropriate, rude, or even cruel, it's somewhat strange to hear such criticism from Donald Trump's inner circle, since the president himself often resorts to much more radical statements. For example, when former special prosecutor Robert Mueller recently passed away, Trump wrote, "Robert Mueller just died. Good, I'm glad he's dead." Or, for instance, director Rob Reiner was also recently killed. In a post, the president said that he was destroyed by Trump derangement syndrome.
Reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome.
There was also an online scandal over a tweet by actor Ben Stiller. He posted the phrase, "Got it done," on his page. The post was made exactly on the day of the assassination attempt on Trump. A number of Republican politicians and commentators began accusing the actor of celebrating the attempt to kill the president. However, it soon turned out that he was simply commenting on a basketball game of his favorite team, which was taking place at the same time. In their search for someone to blame, the White House administration also leveled accusations against James Comey, the former FBI director. Trump had long had a tense relationship with him. Back in 2017, the president fired the director because he was investigating people in Trump's inner circle for possible ties to Russia. During Trump's second term, the Justice Department brought charges against Comey, but at that time they fell apart in court. Now, the former FBI director is being accused of threatening to kill the President of the United States.
That the defendant, James Comey, knowingly and willfully transmitting in interstate commerce a communication that contained a threat to kill the President of the United States. Both of these counts carry a maximum term of imprisonment of 10 years.
The message that ended up at the center of the scandal is this post that Comey made last year. These are the numbers 8647, laid out with seashells on the sand. In American slang, the number 86 is sometimes used as a verb meaning to get rid of, throw out, or refuse service, and the number 47 refers to the 47th President of the United States, that is, Donald Trump. It must be said that this is quite an unprecedented prosecution. There are plenty of people online who have used similar slang phrases. For example, a hugely popular pro-MAGA account posted a similar combination of numbers a few years ago, 8646. That is, get rid of the 46th President, Biden. A simple search for 8646 shows that there are plenty of products with this symbolism being sold online. Notebooks, t-shirts, caps, mugs, and so on. None of these people have ever been prosecuted for threatening the life of the president, neither under Biden nor under Trump. James Comey does not admit guilt and intends to defend himself in court.
Well, they're back. This time about a picture of seashells on a North Carolina beach a year ago. And this won't be the end of it. But nothing has changed with me. I'm still innocent. I'm still not afraid. And I still believe in the independent federal judiciary, so let's go.
What will come of this is still unclear, but it is very unlikely that the jury will find him guilty. Assassination attempts on presidents are not uncommon in US history. Over the many decades, there have been a great number of such incidents, and each one was different. Sometimes the assassins acted out of ideological hatred, and sometimes it was a personal grievance. Often, these were people who were not entirely mentally stable. Over time, assassination attempts have become more frequent, but now the head of state also has a professional secret service that protects him successfully, at least in the overwhelming majority of cases. Nevertheless, the very trend of Americans resorting to political violence more often is certainly alarming, even if a particular assassination attempt did not result in any deaths. The situation continues to escalate. Each such assassination attempt further deepens the already enormous divide in American society. Each side increasingly believes its actions are justified. It's merely a response to what their opponents are doing. Each such assassination attempt convinces the opposing side of their own righteousness. At the same time, according to polls, most Americans now agree that political violence in the country is a problem. Since 2011, NBC News has conducted polls after such violent incidents. Respondents were asked, did the violence occur because of an aggressive political climate or because of the actions of a single unbalanced individual? Over time, more and more people consistently choose the first option. The fiery rhetoric and overall tension are to blame. Americans believe that both sides are responsible for promoting such rhetoric, although respondents make such statements about Republicans a bit more often. 69% of those surveyed say that the Republican Party has gone too far on this issue. 60% of citizens say the same about the Democrats. Even though most people are concerned about the tension in the political climate, neither side wants to give in. Republicans have the attempted assassination of Trump and the murder of Charlie Kirk fresh in their minds. They see this as a direct consequence of the Democrats' aggressive rhetoric, since they call Trump a fascist, his supporters far-right extremists, and a threat to democracy. Democrats blame the president himself for inciting hatred. They recall the murder of Melissa Hortman, the killing of 2 protesters by ICE officers, and believe that Trump and his supporters are to blame for provoking violence. After all, they also claim that the Democratic Party is a terrorist organization of radical left-wing extremists. How the United States will get out of this situation, no one knows yet, not even the Americans themselves.
Something like that.